Right, let's pick up from where we left off in the last video. So Lord Henry is telling Dorian that the most important thing worth having is youth, and beauty is a form of genius. Okay. Now we can obviously recognize the flaws in what Lord Henry is saying, and anybody with any iota of wokeness, as we would call it nowadays, would know that you can't place all of your emphasis on youth and beauty, because beauty is subjective, youth doesn't last forever, and there are far more important things like one's moral fiber, one's character, you know, the real substance of life. But remember, Dorian Gray is incredibly impressionable. Lord Henry is very charismatic, and the kinds of things that Lord Henry is saying to Dorian are ringing true to him because of certain things he's thought of in the past. Right, so he says, oh, you smile. Well, you won't smile when you've lost your beauty. People say sometimes beauty is only superficial. To me, beauty is the wonder of wonders. It's only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. Paradox there, typical Lord Henry aphorism. Yes, Mr. Gray, the gods have been good to you, but what the gods give, they quickly take away. You have only a few years in which to live really fully and perfectly. Now, that's a horrible thing to say to somebody who's young and say, like, well, as soon as you start aging, it's all over, so you may as well make it count now. And of course, it does have a damaging effect on Dorian because of his reaction now when he sees his portrait in a few pages' time. So what Lord Henry, while they're still outside, he says, oh, whoops, gone on too far. He says to Dorian, live the wonderful life that is in you. Be always searching for new sensations. Be afraid of nothing. A new hedonism. So he goes back to the idea of, well, you've got to embrace all of this and take what you can from life while you can. The world belongs to you for a season. I thought how tragic it would be if you were wasted, for there is such little time that your youth will last, such a little time. Every day, every second, you're getting a little bit older, so I felt I needed to tell you this now. And then he says, we degenerate into hideous puppets, haunted by the memories of the passion which we were too much afraid, and the exquisite temptations we had not the courage to yield to. Youth, there is absolutely nothing in the world but youth. And he's going on a bit of a tangent now. And you kind of maybe see a little bit of him perhaps wanting to live vicariously through Dorian's youth. I mean, he's only slightly older than Dorian, but he's not as beautiful. And he sees somebody who he can imprint his own thoughts and feelings about the world in, and he's trying quite convincingly to do so. Sorry, I'm getting very distracted by a needy golden retriever. Okay. Yes, my boy, you're very beautiful. Okay. Lord Henry says to Dorian, you are glad to have met me. And Dorian makes this lovely, kind of astute observation at this point. And he says, yes, I'm glad now. I wonder, shall I always be glad? And of course, we know that there are many times during the story where Dorian stops and says, no, I'm not going to listen to Lord Henry anymore. I shouldn't have listened to what he said to me. It kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay. So now the second part of this chapter, they enter into the studio. And the Dorian that left the studio and the Dorian that enters is a very different person, because he's now kind of had the scales fall from his eyes and certain things have been made clear to him, as he thinks, by Lord Henry. And so Dorian sits down and he sits for Lord Henry to do all the finishing touches of the painting. And as he's sitting, all of this new information is going round and round in his brain, and he's thinking about everything. And so when the portrait is finished, like Dorian Gray startles as if he was, kind of away in a dream. He was daydreaming. And Basil says to me, you've sat quite splendidly. I'm awfully obliged to you. And Lord Henry has this little smug observation. He says, oh, that's entirely due to me, isn't it, Mr. Gray? Because he knows the reason that Dorian was sat so still and quietly was because he was completely wrapped and lost in thought by all of these things that Lord Henry had been talking to him about. you can see he's loving the influence that he already is just loving the influence he has on Dorian Gray. So this is now Dorian's reaction to his portrait. So when he saw it, he drew back, and his cheeks flushed for a moment with pleasure, as if he had recognized himself for the first time. The sense of his own beauty came on him like a revelation. He'd never felt it before. Okay. So Basil's compliments and other people telling Dorian that he's beautiful or handsome, whatever, has never really had an effect on him. It's never made him think that he is. I kind of liken it to, parents or maybe older people in your family will say to you, "Oh, you're so pretty," or "You're so handsome," or "You're such a handsome little chap, such a beautiful little girl," and you're like, yeah, because it's coming from a place of people who have to love you anyway. And then you meet somebody, perhaps somebody you admire or a romantic partner, and when they tell you that you're handsome or hot or sexy or beautiful, then it's like, "Ooh, maybe I am." It feels better, So nothing that people had said to him before, it said they had not influenced his nature, but then came Lord Henry with this strange panegyric, it's a very strange word there, which basically just means like a kind of speech on youth, this terrible warning of its brevity that had stirred him at the time, and now, as he stood gazing at the shadow of his own loveliness, the full reality of the description flashed across him. So kind of everything, when he sees this picture of himself and he sees how stunning he looks, everything kind of makes sense to him, and he realizes, wow, I am really beautiful, but oh my goodness, this isn't going to last forever, because now this painting is like going to be a daily reminder that I don't look like that anymore. As you guys will get older, you'll look back on your photos on your Instagram feed or something from 10 years ago when you reach my age, and you go, "Oh, I didn't appreciate how young I was then." It'll happen, trust me. Okay. And this actually causes Dorian to, instead of being glad about his youth and his beauty, he starts to feel sad. And he realizes that the life that was to make his soul would mar his body. So everything that he would enjoy in life would increase the richness of his soul, but it would age his body. His eyes deepened into amethyst, and across them came a mist of tears. He felt as if a hand of ice had been laid upon his heart. So that, that sinking feeling you get when you realize something awful. And Dorian murmurs, "How sad," as he looks at this portrait. "I shall grow old and horrible and dreadful." So he immediately, because of what Lord Henry said now, he's equating age with ugliness and youth with beauty, which of course isn't true. We all know there's beauty in aging and laughter lines and wrinkles and a life well lived. But this picture will remain always young. It will never be older than this particular day of June. If it were only the other way, if it were I who would always be young, and the picture that was to grow old, for that I would give everything. Yes, there's nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that. And he is muttering this as kind of just a thought, and he doesn't realize at this moment that there's some sort of, maybe going to suspend disbelief here in the novel, there's some sort of interchange that takes place now between Dorian and the painting that he's not aware of. He's just making a kind of offhand wish. And so Basil objects to this and says, "Well, I wouldn't want my painting to get old." And Dorian is kind of harsh with Basil, which is unlike him. And he says, "Yes, you like your art better than your friends. I'm no more to you in a green bronze figure, hardly as much, I dare say." And Basil is shocked. That was so unlike Dorian to speak like that. What had happened? Dorian says, "Yes, how long will you like me? Till I have my first wrinkle, I suppose. I know now that when one loses one's good look, whatever they may be, one loses everything. Your picture has taught me that." Lord Henry is perfectly right. It's interesting how he blames the picture for showing him his youth and beauty, and then reminding him that it's going to be gone, instead of directing it towards the actual person who made him realize that, which is Lord Henry. "Youth is the only thing worth having. When I find that I'm growing old, I shall kill myself," which also becomes indirectly a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm jealous of the portrait you've painted of me. If only, and he repeats it, this wish now, if only it were the other way. If the picture could change and I could be always what I am now. Why did you paint it? It will mock me someday, mock me horribly. And then again, we have this moment. Remember, I said earlier, Dorian's kind of behaving a little bit like a petulant child. He flings himself down on the sofa. The divan is like an old-fashioned word for like a side sofa, and buries his face in the cushions. And Basil realizes, of course, that exactly what he hadn't wanted to happen has happened. Lord Henry has said and done something that has changed his beautiful, innocent Lord Dorian into this petulant, self-aware person. He says, "This is your doing, Harry," bitterly. And Lord Henry shrugs and says, "This is the real Dorian Gray." It's not. Well, if it isn't, then what have I to do with it? So Lord Henry discovers that, or wants Basil to think, well, I've just exposed what was there all along, which is a good argument when we discuss later on in the story, like to what degree is Lord Henry responsible? Well, could he have awoken something in Dorian that wasn't kind of festering beneath the surface there already? Like how powerful is the suggestion that Dorian just immediately takes what Lord Henry says and runs with it, if it wasn't already the potential for it to be there in the first place. And Basil is so upset that he grabs, and you'll notice the distinct parallels now between this, the chapter where Basil dies, and the final chapter when Dorian destroys the painting. He reaches for the palette knife and he holds it as if he's going to rip up the canvas, and then Dorian launches over and says, "Don't, Basil, it would be murder." Also, lovely foreshadowing there, lovely kind of irony, because you can see already that Dorian kind of he hasn't, there's no now separation between him and the portrait. It's like the portrait is him, not just a picture of him. And Basil says, "Oh, well, at least now you appreciate it." And Dorian says, "I'm in love with it. It's part of myself." Okay. So even though Dorian doesn't know it, this sort of interchange has happened between him and the portrait. And though he doesn't acknowledge it, maybe on some level he feels it, because he feels like, if somebody took a photo and you ripped it up, you'd be like, "Hey, don't do that." But you wouldn't be like, "No, you're killing me." That kind of overreaction. Okay. If you let anyone have it but me, Basil, says Dorian, I shall never forgive you. And I don't allow people to call me a silly boy. Okay, so he's acting very petulant now and being very oppositional to Basil. And Basil says, "Well, the picture is yours. I gave it to you before it existed." And you've been a little silly, Mr. Gray, that you don't really object to being reminded that you're extremely young. This is now Lord Henry. And Dorian says, "I would have objected very strongly this morning, Lord Henry." Lord Henry says, "This morning, but you've lived since then, haven't you?" Again, when he says to Basil, yeah, and Dorian's like, "Yes, it's my fault that he sat so quietly because I gave him so much to think about." So it's almost like he knows he's made a change in Dorian, and he knows that Dorian is now different because of what he said to him. What he said has had such a profound influence on Dorian's thought about the world. And like, "You've lived," in other words, yes, I've shown you the secret to life. He's such a pompous old bugger. Okay. And then the ending of this chapter kind of links to the ending of the previous chapter, because Basil said to Henry, "Don't influence him. Your influence would be bad. He doesn't want to lose Dorian to Lord Henry." But this is exactly what has happened, because Lord Henry invites him to the theatre. Basil says, "I don't want to go. I shall stay with the real Dorian." Interesting now. It's almost as if he realizes that what he's captured there in that moment, even though it's going to change, in that moment, the picture is more like the Dorian he knows, because the Dorian in the flesh has been changed. And all he has left now is his memory of what Dorian used to be before he changed as a result of Lord Henry's influence. Lord Henry says, "Is it the real Dorian?" "Oh, sorry," says Dorian. "Is it the real Dorian? Am I really like that?" "Yes, you are." "How wonderful. At least you are like it in appearance, but it will never alter, says Basil. So Dorian is very happy that he looks like that. Basil is sad because he'll never be like that